Hello, welcome or welcome back. My name is Jo, and today we are going to wrap up the games, series, and books that I have been consuming lately. Chapters will be below for what section if you're only interested in one of these. I have the most books, so those are at the end. But games. So I just got into gaming in the past few months, and so I have 2 games now that I have kind of finished, I guess, on my Switch, so we'll talk about those first. The first one is the game Pentiment, and this one is a very interesting premise for a game, very, very unique. So it is a mystery game that is set in, oh god, I don't even know what time it's set in. It'll be on the screen here, but we're in Bavaria, basically, I think, at a monastery where a young artist is working, doing like his great work as part of his education. Things start to unfold in this town where he is trying to figure out what is going on. There's all kinds of historical, cultural, artistic, religious, all kinds of background information that's being presented all the time. And so it's a really, really interesting premise. Unfortunately, I am, at least for now, DNFing this. Well, I'm definitely DNFing this run of the game. So there are 3 acts to this game. I won't go into exactly what they are for like spoiler reasons, but I was actually in the 3rd act, and so I was like relatively close to being done. I did have 15 hours in the game already, which the alleged how to beat time was 15 hours, or like 15 and a half or something. I was definitely going to take longer than that, but not obviously like significantly. I was probably 3 or 4 hours away from beating it, I assume. But there's not really beating this game, it's just like finishing that storyline. And depending on the decisions that you make in the game, there are many different ways that the story can play out. And to be honest, I just didn't care about how it played out in my run of the game. And again, this is something that I might revisit later, but kind of my mistake with this game, and that's maybe partially due to being a new gamer, but also this is constantly presented as a game that's best to go into without really knowing anything beforehand, and I actually disagree with that. I would have been much better off going into it being at least a little bit familiar with how the game worked. So I will say some things about how the game worked now. If you don't want to know them, you can skip them. But you are, solving this mystery, which I vaguely knew that it was going to be a mystery, but I wasn't aware that there's no correct answer. There might be a correct answer, but the point is not to find the correct answer, and you do not find out like in real time whether you have the correct answer or not. The point of the game is to see the results of your actions and other people's actions, of course. The things that you investigate are what you're able to use later on in the game. So you have to be very intentional about what you do. And I was not intentional about what I did because I was just like vibing out. Like I was just wandering around talking to people as they came up. I didn't take any notes. I would pursue things that came up, if it was like a promising piece of information. Obviously, I would go talk to whatever person they mentioned or whatever the case might be, but I was not intentional whatsoever. And so that continued to come back and bite me throughout the entire game because I didn't have notes to fall back on. I had no idea what was like, I couldn't remember a lot of the different characters and everything. And so I was just, again, finding myself not really caring about how things turned out. So if I do go back and play this again, I will definitely do it very differently. I do think regardless, it's unnecessarily long. Like, I don't think this needs to be a 15-hour game. I think it would have been better suited as maybe like an 8-hour game. So I'm not in any rush to replay it. I definitely want to wait until I have forgotten a lot more. So this will definitely go like to the back of my list of games. But again, I'd be interested in replaying it potentially someday, but we will see. Then I did finish just a little puzzle game that I think took me about 5 hours to finish, called Agent A Puzzle in Disguise. This is a kind of retro themed spy puzzle game where you are an agent A trying to catch this criminal. And so you're at her lair kind of, and she has set up all these traps and crazy things for you to navigate through in order to try to catch her. It was pretty fun, but unfortunately quite a few of the puzzles felt a lot more like busy work than any actual interesting puzzles. There were quite a number of like, get this string of numbers or letters or symbols and plug it in here. And like, that's just boring. Like, you either have to write them down or take a picture. Like, I just ended up taking a picture of my screen, like anytime anything came up, because I knew I was going to need it later. And like, that's just not very interesting. And then there were some puzzles that were super easy and some that were like, I did look up a few things when I was stuck. And some of them I was like, how would I ever have known to do that? And like, that's fine. I would rather have things be a little bit too difficult and look them up than too easy, and I feel like I'm just wasting my time. But nonetheless, it felt uneven, I guess you could say, with the amount of super easy and then a couple like really difficult, and then there were like maybe 25% just right. I got it on sale for $1.99. And so for that price, it was definitely absolutely worth it. If I'd paid full price, I would be upset for sure. This is also available on mobile, but even as mobile game, it's $10, and I do not think it would be worth it for $10, let alone more than that. So now we have series. So the two interesting series that I have watched recently are season 2 of Severance and season 2 of Silo. Both of these shows are on Apple TV, which is annoying because a lot of people don't have Apple TV. But so first up, Severance, because that's the one that just finished. So I absolutely adored season 2, probably close to as much as season 1, maybe just as much as season 1, but differently. So I haven't even told you what Severance is about. So Severance is about a company, primarily about one character named Mark, who works this company called Lumen, which has a department, multiple departments that are severed departments. And so if you work in that, in a severed position, you have an implant in your brain that severs the part of your brain that is at work. So basically, like, you have a separate you, only exists there. It has no memory of anything that's ever happened outside of work. It doesn't have memory of anything that happened as soon as you left work. It has only ever existed at work. And when you are out of work, you also don't remember anything that happened at work. Super interesting premise for so many reasons. You know, the story develops beyond just that premise, but the premise alone is fascinating because of this concept of like work and the way that we do kind of require that like separation, and how like people will kind of try to force that of like, they're so unhappy at work, but they're like, no, you have to, like, that version of me still has to like do that because this version of me needs that and everything. So super interesting commentary just inherently in the premise. Season 1 was pretty evenly paced, like a pretty just balanced season. Season 2, on the other hand, the pacing of this season was bonkers. Like, some episodes, basically nothing happened, and other episodes, so much stuff was packed into one episode. So yeah, that was really weird and kind of whiplash inducing, and also kind of annoying because sometimes it was like, we could be getting through so much more story. But they also did take a lot more like creative risks this season, so I do appreciate that. But this season also, you know, obviously is developing more of the story of this company, why they're doing any of this. Like, you're not gonna get like clear answers from these seasons, at least. I don't know if we will get them in the future, but you do get more information. But yeah, this season did have one of my favorite TV show episodes that I've ever watched in my entire life. So I love this show so much. We had to wait years for the second season because of the writer's strike and everything, which, totally support. But I really hope that this third season will be a little bit more forthcoming. Then Silo. So after such a solid season 1 of Silo, I was unfortunately really let down by season 2. So Silo is following a series of books. There's a trilogy. So Silo is telling the story of this like civilization of people who live in a bunker, but like a very, very, very large bunker called the silo. Underground, it's like a corkscrew kind of shape. There are like, I don't know, hundreds of levels. It's like a whole functioning world under there with like farms and water and air purifying and all this stuff. And obviously it's very like highly controlled in order to keep society functioning. But one of the like rules of the society is that if you say that you want to go outside, you have to go outside. Like, you cannot take it back. You are allowed to go outside, but you cannot take it back if you said that. And they will put you outside in this little space suit thing. And then, you will see what happens. We're following different characters like the sheriff of the silo, an engineer from what's called like the Down Deep, I think, who works on like the generator that keeps the whole thing running, the mayor, all kinds of characters that I really thought were super well developed in the first book and also in the first season of the show. I thought that they did a great job. They actually even made some changes from the book that I thought were good, like better than the book. I still thought the book was a little bit better, but there were certain characters that I thought the show did a better job with. And the first season of Silo covers approximately, I haven't read this in a long time, so I could be wrong here, but I'm pretty sure it covered like 75% of the first book. Like, most of the first book is in the first season of Silo. So I was really hoping that they were going to move along fairly quickly. I also did not like book 2 in the series very much, and I felt like it was drawn out unnecessarily. So I personally felt like season 2 of Silo could have just been the end of book 1 and all of book 2. Unfortunately, it was not. Instead of moving along snappy, we wallowed around inventing episodes and plot out of nothing. You can't even really call it plot because it was just the same things happening every episode for like the whole second season. Like, they did not move on past the first book at all. They just beat the same dead horses for an entire season, and I have no idea why. Like, I didn't hate it, but I was bored almost every single episode. And they are finally done. The end of the second season was the beginning of the second book, so I'm hoping that the next season improves a little bit, but I am very disappointed because I really did think that the first season did such a good job, and this one they just drug it out so much, and I have no idea why. So that was disappointing, but we shall see. On to books. So this is not all of the books that I've read since the last time I made a wrap up, which was last October, but it is the ones that I felt like I had anything to say about. So the first one is Legends and Lattes. This is obviously a super hyped, cozy fantasy book from years ago at this point that, better late than never. I finally got around to reading it. I read it with my book club on my language learning content Patreon. So I did read this in Spanish, and I really thought somehow this whole time, part of why it took me so long to read this book is somehow I was just convinced that I was going to be like that person who didn't like this book and was just like a hater. And I was like, I don't want to be that person, but I wasn't. I liked this book. I am glad somewhat that I waited to read it a little bit for like the hype to die down, maybe. I don't know. It might have been fine even if I hadn't, but I didn't go in with like huge expectations. So that also, I think, always helps. This is a super adorable book about an orc who is kind of hanging up her mercenary gear, and she wants to open a coffee shop, but in this like fantasy world outside of elf world. I can't even remember. Outside of some specific community, coffee really does not exist, and so she's not only trying to like open this small business in a new town where she doesn't know anybody, she's also kind of trying to invent the concept of a cafe and of drinking coffee in a place where nobody's really heard of that. And so this isn't like no stakes, like stuff does happen, there is conflict in this book, but you know, for a book about like an orc, it's definitely lower stakes, lower conflict than the vast majority. And I really, really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, the character that I most want a follow-up book about does not have one, and I don't know if there's ever been any intention of making one, but I'm not particularly interested in the prequel. I'm sure I will read it at some point, because, you know, if I want another cozy book like this, which I think I probably will, like, I love the premise of this, I love the setting of this, it's adorable, so I'm sure I will read it, but I'm not specifically interested in the story, whereas I would be super specifically interested in the story of this guy, and I can't even talk about it because you should just experience it in the book. So yeah. Next book that I read was a book called Vera, and this is a lesser known kind of, I don't know if you would call this a modern classic. I think it was written in like the 1920s, that kind of unofficially inspired the book Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And so this is really quite a depressing book, even though it is written comedically in a weird way. So it's like funny in some senses. I don't know. So you are following, again, very, very similar setup, although it does depart quite a bit from it, to Rebecca. So you are following a young girl whose father has just passed away when you meet her, and she meets this older guy whose wife has just passed away in like weird circumstances. The girl is kind of under the care of this older woman, and surprisingly, this kind of romance ensues that nobody really expected. Like, I feel like Rebecca is more like about the drama. Like, obviously you can still draw a lot of like disturbing things about the relationship and about the dynamic of the relationship from it, for sure, but they're not like painful necessarily to read. I don't know how to explain what I'm trying to say, but like Vera was like just horrible. Like, you're just reading about like this girl who's like, wait, why does he like see me that way? I don't really get it. Like, and then he kind of wins her over and is like doting on her and everything, and then things turn when she's not just like, you know, an NPC who fulfills his every single, I can't think of what I'm trying to say, capriccio, what is it called, whim. Again, there were lines that were really like clever and kind of like stabbing a little bit wit about how stupid this man was, but in general I found it quite depressing to read. But it's not very long, and it ends extremely abruptly. Like, I'm fine with open-ended books. I don't feel the need for everything to have like a nice wrapped up ending, but this one, honestly, if you had told me like that she left it unfinished, I would have believed that more easily. Like, it just kind of ended. So it wasn't like the most satisfying read, but if you like Rebecca, I think it is a really good kind of parallel to read. I don't know. It was interesting. Infuriating, but interesting. Then I won't talk about this long because it does only exist in Spanish, but if you want to read up on the subject, there's obviously articles and everything online. And if you are interested in all of the books that I read in Spanish, I have videos about that on my other channel. But the book Tu nombre no es tu nombre is about the children during the Argentinian dictatorship that were taken from their parents, most of whom were disappeared by the regime, and the kids were given to other like military families or whatever to raise as their own, basically. So I think most of them were babies or extremely young. And so they, for the most part, did not even know that they were adopted. And even if they did, they obviously didn't know the circumstances. And so you were specifically following one woman who found out at like 19 or 20 that she was one of these kids. And so yeah, super, super sad story. Very important thing to learn about, though, especially since we are now literally witnessing people being disappeared in the United States. Absolutely horrifying, and something that's super important to learn about and to stand up against in our own countries here in the modern world. So then we have two kind of literary fictions, I guess we can talk about. Penance by Eliza Clark. This is a confusing book to me because I went into this always having heard that this was supposed to be a critique of the true crime genre, but I barely saw that, to be honest, reading it. Like, there's an extremely surface level kind of acknowledgement of that at the beginning, where it talks about how the kind of narrator of the story is not necessarily unbiased in his presentation. But other than that, like, there's some times where I could see kind of where she maybe was trying to critique it, but it didn't necessarily come off as a critique. It kind of just came off as like participation in the genre, in my opinion. So we're following the story of a super, super brutal murder in the UK where a group of girls killed one of their classmates, another girl. So you're following like I can't remember, where it's a book. It's a journalist who wrote a book following the case, and definitely didn't like necessarily get all of his information in an ethical way, etc. But the way that the book reads, it just reads like, true crime. Like, the part of my brain that like kicked in reading this book was the same part that like enjoys reading thrillers, used to like enjoy true crime before I like really thought about the implications of that genre and decided to, for the most part, not participate in it anymore. Like, it just, I don't think she did enough with the critique and ended up kind of just participating in the genre instead. I don't know. Because like, if you read it having that perspective beforehand, obviously, which like I do, then like, yeah, you can be like, wow, this is kind of unethical telling the story. But the story itself doesn't necessarily do that, in my opinion. I don't know. I actually did think that even though it was limited, the discussion of class in the book was actually a lot more interesting than the discussion of like true crime as a genre, because class was like a really important part of the dynamic of the town. It was a really important part of the crime, of the dynamic between the girls. Yeah, it was just, that discussion was, I felt like, a little bit more fleshed out than the other one. So yeah, I don't know, maybe it was just me, maybe I just didn't like think deeply enough about this book, but I know that I'm not the only person who feels this way. Also, I just remembered, there's this whole portion of the book towards the end that is just a very, very detailed depiction of a school shooting. Yeah, I forgot about, how did I forget about, I think I blocked that out, like, whew, no, I don't like that at all. Yeah, no. Okay, so anyway, Penance was not for me. Another literary fail for me, this one even worse, I think, was Boulder. And I'm so surprised by this because this was another book club pick for my Spanish book club. I thought I was going to love this book because I've seen so many people talk about it in, pretty much a raving positive way. That is so thought-provoking. It's so interesting. Such an interesting discussion on like not wanting to have children, all this kind of things. I actually hated this book, like loathed this book. The writing is actually really lovely, especially in Spanish, and I'm sure even more so in Catalan, which is the original language it was written in. because I think romance languages in general are much more forgiving of like really quote unquote overwrought writing, like super flowery, super expressive language. I think it tends to come off better. So, you know, a lot of the people who do write negative reviews talk about how ridiculous some of the writing was, and I do think that's probably, you know, potentially an issue for many people. For me, it didn't specifically bother me, except that I already didn't like the main character, so then when you're adding that in, it just adds to the perception of her as a super pretentious, egotistical person. So we're following a woman named, well, she's not named Boulder, but she's called Boulder. Starts out as a cook and kind of finds her calling more or less working as a cook on a ship, like a working ship. And she just kind of revels in that life, like the really difficult long hours, just like laborious grind. But she ends up meeting a woman who is Icelandic, I'm pretty sure, and they meet in Chile and fall in love, allegedly, and end up kind of seeing each other regularly and end up moving to Iceland together when this woman takes, or like is relocated for her job or takes a different job back in Iceland. She works in petroleum. And so she kind of, you know, uproots her life, moves with this woman, and they have very different life goals, very different views on everything, seemingly. And I hated it. Oh my god. The way that they talked about each other, like, okay, so you're only hearing from Boulder. The way that she talks about her is just entirely about how much she likes to F her, and the way that she talks about how her partner talks to her. It also seems like the partner doesn't really like get her as a person, or doesn't like think that she's like smart, you know, like she thinks that like she's like her little pet or something, you know, like my weird little creature. Which, you know, obviously you're not hearing from her, so it might not be an accurate perception, but that's at least how Boulder perceives their relationship, which is bad enough on its own. And yeah, there is never even once in this book did I feel like there was any genuine like affection or love between these people. It was truly just lust and enjoying those activities, which is great. Do each other. But I don't really care about your life together when you like are awful to each other and like have no real communication, no real anything. Like all of the reviews that I read about this book were like, what is it like when like the person that you love like changes because they had a baby, or like they're like blah 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 blah. They want, you know, you love each other so much, but they want this life and you don't. I'm like, where are you seeing the love? Because I don't see the love. But regardless, even then, like, they, you know, the partner gets pregnant, and like the way that Boulder talks about the whole pregnancy and about her as a pregnant person, I'm like, oh my god. And then like they have the baby, and then it does get a little bit more nuanced. There's a little bit more. And then there was like whole thing at the end, which is like, whoa, wow. But I didn't care about any of it because I hated these people and I did not think that they should be together. Like this is just like, I put on Instagram like this big cringe face with like when the couple that you know that hates each other starts talking about having babies, and you're like, why would you do that? and I'm like a child-free person that like I love children, and I have at various points wanted to have them and decided not and decided that that isn't something that I want. And I also am not a person who's like romantic at all. So like you would think that I would go into this like being super understanding of Boulder, and I was at the beginning until she was like talking about like literally if you changed the pronouns, nothing else, find and replace just Boulder's pronouns with he, this book would just be about a cis straight man who talks and acts like a pig, talks about his pregnant wife like a complete asshole, and yeah, it's just a dick. Like, kind of turns out maybe-ish, like understandably okay, maybe, but you're like, wow, what a jackass, like the whole way through. And it's not that I don't think that those stories deserve to like be told or whatever. Like, it's great that we can tell stories about lesbians being pigs, I guess, but I don't want to read it, and that's not how this is presented. This is presented as a story of love. Like, I don't get it at all. I think it would have been so much more impactful if it was about a couple who actually seemed like they genuinely loved each other but did want different things. Like, that's so valid to like have those qualms about having kids, that's never been something that you wanted, that you are kind of more of that independent person who just wants to like be out at sea, or whatever your, metaphorical at sea is. Like, I mean, to be honest, that's kind of me. So like, I truly would understand this book if she wasn't just like a jackass. So yeah, I hated this book. Lastly, I reread all of the Hunger Games books again, and I read Sunrise on the Reaping. So this series, somehow, even with all of the hype, I do still sometimes feel like this is an underhyped series, because real readers, like the literary ones, don't read this series at all, which is understandable, but also I feel like you're missing out, because this series, I mean, now more than ever, but has always had so much to say. The original Hunger Games series, obviously we are following Katniss, who is sent to the Hunger Games, which is a punishment that the Capitol has inflicted on the other districts in order to kind of keep them under their thumb after they tried to rebel. So the Capitol was taking all of the profit of everything that they created, taking all of their produce and everything that they created, and using it for themselves, and only giving them enough to like scrape by. So Katniss comes from District 12, which is the mining region, which is also would be basically where I came from in the United States as well. Obviously many things unfold, but you are following kind of the long-term rebellion of the districts to try to take back, the means of production and all of that, but also like the story, the power of like the ability to control the narrative, to how is this tiny group of Capitol, not even Capitol citizens so much as the people in control, how are they able to control the much, much bigger districts? How is propaganda used to control the Capitol citizens, who also don't always necessarily have it really great, but obviously have it much better than the districts. Yet somehow this series is sold as this love triangle between Katniss and two boys. It's like, again, speaking of the narrative. But anyway, so I re-listened to the original trilogy because they just put out them as Spanish audiobooks, so I bought all of them with Kobo credits so that I can listen to them to my heart's content. And I also got The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which I'm re-listening to right now, but I re-listened to all of those in preparation for Sunrise on the Reaping, which is the story of Haymitch's game. So Haymitch is the mentor of Katniss and Peeta. So Haymitch had won the games 24 years before them. And in the main trilogy, he is a raging alcoholic, super unreliable, but also endearing. And you do find out quite a bit of how he ended up the way that he is in the main trilogy. But this is the story of his games. And this book is primarily about propaganda and about how the story that is told and preserved can be completely different than what happened. And it's also a lot about like how your actions, even if they kind of fail at the time, they go into this larger fabric of how resistance is like born and sustained throughout years before it is actually successful. And yeah, so powerful, so sad. Like I cried like 20 pages into this book, and then I cried like 10 more times, and I even knew most of exactly what was going to happen, obviously, because of prior books. So yeah, I really liked this book. If you didn't like The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which is quite a different kind of book than the original trilogy, I do think you will still like this book because this is very similar to the original trilogy. So yeah, that's everything that I have to say. If you have comments on any of these things, definitely leave them down below, and I will see you in the next video.